March 7, 1945, Remagen, Germany. The bridge still stood. That was the first shock. As the lead elements of Combat Command B, 9th Armored Division approached the heights overlooking the Rhine River Valley on that gray March afternoon, they expected to see nothing but twisted steel and shattered stone, where the Ludendorff Bridge had once spanned Germany's greatest natural barrier. Every other bridge across the Rhine had been destroyed by retreating German forces. This one should have been rubble. Lieutenant Karl Friesenhahn, the German engineer officer responsible for the bridge's demolition, stood at the eastern end of the structure checking the explosive charges for the third time that morning. At 32, Friesenhahn had survived 4 years of war from France to Russia and back to Germany's doorstep. He was methodical, careful, professional. The charges were ready. The detonator was tested. The electrical circuits were checked. When the order came, he would drop the bridge into the Rhine. "Everything is prepared," he told Captain Willy Bratsch, the bridge's commanding officer. "When you give the word, the bridge goes down." Bratsch nodded, but his face showed the strain of the past weeks. His fortress battalion was a collection of barely trained old men, teenagers, and recovering wounded. The 600 men under his command included sailors with no ships, Luftwaffe personnel with no aircraft, and Volkssturm militia who had received their rifles only days earlier. Against the entire American First Army pressing toward the Rhine, Bratsch's force was theatrical at best. But Berlin had been explicit: hold until the last moment, then destroy the bridge. No bridge could fall intact into American hands. What neither Friesenhahn nor Bratsch could have known as they conducted their final inspections was that within 3 hours, American infantry would be crossing that bridge on foot. Within 6 hours, American tanks would roll across. Within 3 days, 5,000 American troops would be on the eastern bank of the Rhine, and the entire German defense strategy for the Western Front would collapse. The bridge at Remagen would become the most valuable piece of real estate in Europe, and its capture would shorten the war by weeks, perhaps months. The mathematics of that March afternoon were brutal and simple. On the western side of the Rhine, 9 American armies numbering more than 4 million men pressed against Germany's frontier. On the eastern side, the Wehrmacht's once formidable defenses had been shredded into ad hoc units, regimental strength formations commanded by generals, divisions commanded by colonels. Germany's production capacity, never matching American output even at its peak, had collapsed under sustained strategic bombing. The factories that once produced tanks and aircraft now produced nothing, their machinery buried under rubble, their workers scattered or dead. The industrial disparity had become total. In 1944, American factories had produced 96,318 aircraft. Germany produced 39,807. American plants built 17,565 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany built 18,956, a remarkable achievement given the bombing campaign, but achieved at devastating cost to other war production. American steel production in 1944 reached 81.3 million tons. German production, including occupied territories, managed 28.5 million tons, and that was before the loss of Silesian facilities in January 1945. By March 1945, the comparison had become grotesque. American monthly aircraft production exceeded 7,000 planes. German production had fallen below 1,000. A single American shipyard, Kaiser's facility at Richmond, California, had produced more Liberty ships than the entire German merchant marine at war's start. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford to produce B-24 bombers, at its peak completed 1 aircraft every 63 minutes. The entire German aircraft industry in March 1945 struggled to complete 63 aircraft in a week. This industrial supremacy translated directly into military capacity. The American units approaching Remagen that March afternoon were lavishly equipped by any standard, absurdly so by German standards of 1945. The 9th Armored Division alone possessed more operational tanks than many German armies. Its supply trains carried ammunition stocks that would have sustained an entire German Panzer Corps for months. Its fuel reserves exceeded what many German units received in a year. When American tankers complained about sea rations, German soldiers were eating bread made partly from sawdust when they ate at all. Lieutenant Emmett J. Burroughs, leading a platoon from a company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, had no idea he was about to become part of history. He was thinking about coffee, a hot meal, and possibly a dry place to sleep. His platoon had been in combat for weeks, driving through the Eifel region in cold rain, taking village after village in grinding, tedious fights against determined but increasingly desperate German resistance. As his half-track crested the hill above Remagen around 1300 hours, he expected to see the Rhine, and to see that all bridges were down. "Holy shit," somebody said, "that bridge is still up." Burroughs grabbed his binoculars. The distinctive black steel arch of the Ludendorff Bridge stretched across the Rhine, intact. Small figures moved on it, Germans, obviously, probably preparing demolitions, but the bridge was standing. "Radio the Co," Burroughs said. "Tell him we've got a bridge." The message went up the chain of command with remarkable speed. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard N. Gemin, commanding officer of the 14th Tank Battalion, received it and immediately ordered his tanks forward. Brigadier General William M. Hoge, commanding Combat Command B, heard the report and made the instant decision that would define his career: take the bridge. Major General John Leonard, commanding the 9th Armored Division, concurred immediately. Within minutes, every available unit was racing toward Remagen. The Germans saw them coming. From his position at the eastern end, Friesenhahn watched American vehicles pouring down the hill into the town. "They're coming," he told Bratsch. "We need to blow it now." Bratsch faced the nightmare choice every rearguard commander dreads. Berlin's orders were explicit: hold until the last moment. Blow the bridge too early and retreating German units on the western bank would be trapped. Blow it too late and Americans would capture it intact. And what was the last moment? When Americans reached the western end. When they started crossing. Bratsch's orders were clear on the outcome required but vague on the timing. At 1500 hours, Bratsch saw American infantry entering Remagen streets. German time had run out. "Blow it," he ordered. Friesenhahn pressed the detonator. Nothing happened. He pressed again, still nothing. The primary demolition circuit had failed, cut by American artillery fire, or sabotaged, or simply failed from age and poor maintenance. Friesenhahn grabbed the backup detonator, a manual plunger system. He ordered his men to set off the primer cord by hand if necessary. At approximately 15:15 hours, a massive explosion shook the bridge. The blast tore a crater 30 feet wide in the bridge deck near the western end. Smoke and debris erupted skyward. German defenders cheered. They'd done it. The bridge was destroyed. But when the smoke cleared, the bridge still stood. The explosion had damaged the deck, blown a hole through the planking, but the main structure remained intact. The Ludendorff Bridge, built during World War I to move supplies to the Western Front, had been engineered to withstand precisely this kind of attack. Its steel arches had absorbed the blast. It was damaged but passable. On the western bank, American infantry had taken cover when the explosion went off. Sergeant Alexander Drabick of a company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, looked up from behind a wall where he'd thrown himself. The bridge was still there. "Son of a bitch," he said. "It's still standing." Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, commanding a company, made his decision in seconds. The bridge was damaged but standing. The Germans would try to blow it again. If Americans were going to cross, they needed to cross now immediately before the Germans could reorganize. "Come on," Timmerman shouted. "We're going over." What happened next became one of the most famous small unit actions of World War II. Timmerman led his company onto the bridge at a run. German machine guns opened fire from the eastern towers and from positions across the river. Mortar rounds began falling. The Americans ran through the fire, some men hugging the bridge railings, others running straight up the damaged roadway. Private Eugene Dorland, carrying his squad's radio, was hit and killed halfway across. Others fell wounded. But most kept running. Drabick, running ahead of most of his squad, became the first American soldier to cross the Rhine. He reached the eastern end at approximately 15:30 hours and immediately took cover in a crater. Behind him, more Americans poured across. Lieutenant Emmett Burroughs and his platoon followed Timmerman's company. Engineers ran onto the bridge carrying wire cutters and mine detectors, racing to cut demolition wires and clear the roadway for vehicles. On the eastern side, Captain Bratsch watched the Americans coming with disbelief turning to horror. They were actually crossing. He ordered every available weapon to fire on the bridge. Machine guns rattled. Mortars dropped rounds onto the bridge deck. But the Americans kept coming, and return fire from the western bank was growing in intensity. American tanks were moving into position, their guns beginning to methodically destroy German firing positions. Friesenhahn made one last attempt. Some charges remained undetonated. With American infantry now on the eastern end fighting among the bridge towers, Friesenhahn tried to set off the remaining demolitions manually. At approximately 1600 hours, more explosions shook the bridge, steel girders twisted, more deck plating blew away. The bridge swayed alarmingly, but again it held. The Ludendorff Bridge, damaged and scarred, remained standing. By 1630 hours, American infantry controlled both ends of the bridge. Engineers were working frantically to shore up the damaged sections and remove remaining German demolitions. The first American tank, a Sherman from the 14th Tank Battalion, started across at 1700 hours. The damaged deck groaned under its weight, but held. By 1800 hours, American armor was rolling across the Rhine. The news reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims that evening. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, received the report from General Courtney Hodges of 1st Army. Bradley immediately telephoned General Dwight D. Eisenhower. "Brad, we've got a bridge," he said. "The boys got a bridge at Remagen." "Hot dog," Eisenhower replied. "Get everything you can across." The impact was immediate and strategic. Allied planning had anticipated a massive set-piece crossing of the Rhine, Operation Plunder, scheduled for late March. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been preparing for weeks, assembling landing craft, building up supplies, planning artillery barrages. The Rhine crossing was to be the Allies' last great river assault, as carefully orchestrated as D-Day. The capture at Remagen changed everything. Within 24 hours, the bridge was carrying continuous traffic. Engineers worked around the clock to repair damage and strengthen the structure. Pontoon bridges were constructed adjacent to the railroad bridge to increase capacity. By March 9, 5 divisions were either across or moving across the Rhine in the Remagen sector. By March 10, the American bridgehead extended 6 miles beyond the river and contained more than 25,000 troops. The German response was panicked and futile. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, recently appointed Commander-in-Chief West, ordered immediate counterattacks to recapture the bridge. Units were pulled from other sectors and rushed toward Remagen, but German mobility had collapsed. Units ordered to move found they had no fuel. Panzer divisions that existed on paper as full-strength formations arrived at Remagen as company-strength Kampfgruppen. The 11th Panzer Division, ordered to counterattack, arrived with 11 operational tanks. Hitler's reaction was predictable and savage. Someone would pay for this disaster. Within days, 5 German officers were arrested, court-martialed, and executed for failing to destroy the bridge. Lieutenant Friesenhahn, the engineer who had tried repeatedly to demolish it, was not among them. He had been captured. Captain Bratsch survived to be taken prisoner, but Major Hans Scheller, Remagen's military commandant, was shot. So was Major August Kraft. 3 others died before firing squads as scapegoats for a failure that was really the Wehrmacht's collective failure. The inevitable result of fighting a war its nation could no longer sustain. The Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the bridge from the air. On March 7, German aircraft attacked but were driven off by American anti-aircraft fire. American fighter cover over the bridge was massive and continuous. Between March 8 and March 17, the Luftwaffe flew hundreds of sorties against the Remagen bridges. They achieved nothing except their own losses. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs controlled the air absolutely. German pilots who survived their missions reported that approaching Remagen meant flying through a wall of steel from American anti-aircraft artillery. The Germans even deployed their secret weapons. On March 17, they launched a V-2 ballistic missile at the bridge, one of the few tactical uses of the V-2, which was primarily a terror weapon against cities. The missile missed. German frogmen swam down the Rhine attempting to attach explosives to the bridge pilings. Most were captured or killed. A few reached the bridges and attempted to plant charges but were driven off by American fire. On March 17, 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed. By then it hardly mattered. American engineers had constructed multiple pontoon bridges, and the bridgehead was firmly established with over 125,000 troops across the Rhine. The collapse killed 28 American engineers who were working on the structure and injured more. But strategically, the bridge had already accomplished its purpose. The Rhine barrier was broken. The industrial disparity that had brought American forces to the Rhine in overwhelming strength now manifested itself in the bridgehead's expansion. American units on the eastern bank received supplies at rates German logistics officers would have found incomprehensible. Fuel trucks brought gasoline in quantities that entire German armies would have requisitioned as a month's supply. Ammunition arrived by the truckload, hundreds of thousands of rounds. More ammunition expended in a single American division's daily operations than many German armies received in a week. The Americans didn't count bullets. They counted them by weight, by truckload, by trainload. When an American infantry company assaulted a position, the attack was preceded by artillery barrages that dwarfed anything the Germans could respond with. A single American Corps artillery concentration could deliver more shells in 15 minutes than the entire German army on that sector could fire in a day. American forward observers called in fire missions casually, expending thousands of shells to suppress positions that might harbor a handful of defenders. The mathematics were simple. American production made ammunition cheap, American lives precious. Germans counted every round and spent lives instead. Medical facilities demonstrated the disparity with similar starkness. American wounded from the Remagen fighting were evacuated to field hospitals equipped with penicillin, plasma, professional surgical teams. Survival rates for wounded American soldiers in 1945 exceeded 90%. German wounded, when they received any treatment at all, were treated in makeshift facilities with inadequate supplies, often by undertrained personnel. Penicillin, which American doctors used routinely, was essentially unavailable in German military hospitals. German soldiers wounded at Remagen who were captured by Americans stood a better chance of survival than those who remained in German care. The food disparity was equally stark. American soldiers complained about C rations and K rations, considering them bland and unappetizing. These rations provided approximately 3,400 calories daily, more than adequate for active combat troops. German rations in March 1945, when they existed at all, provided barely 1,500 calories. American soldiers threw away coffee, cigarettes, chocolate that German soldiers would have considered luxury items. American medics carried morphine syrettes that German medical personnel had learned to search for on captured or dead Americans, so valuable had they become. The tactical implications were profound. Well-fed, well-equipped American troops could sustain continuous operations. German troops, hungry and exhausted, fought with remarkable tenacity given their circumstances, but sheer determination couldn't substitute for absent supplies. When Americans encountered determined resistance, they called in overwhelming firepower and waited. Germans, facing overwhelming firepower, had to choose between withdrawing or dying in place. Withdrawal was often impossible due to lack of vehicles and fuel. German veterans of the Eastern Front who faced Americans for the first time in 1945 noted the difference immediately. Soviet attacks had been costly human wave assaults, expendable infantry thrown at positions until they fell. American attacks were machine-like progressions of firepower followed by cautious advances. Firepower again, more advances. Americans acted as though they had infinite ammunition and infinite time, because effectively they did. Captain Bratch, interrogated after his capture, provided a stark assessment. "We were not defeated by superior tactics or strategy," he said. "We were defeated by superior production. The Americans didn't bring twice as many tanks or guns. They brought 10 times as many. When we destroyed one, 2 more appeared. When we held a position against one assault, 3 more came. It wasn't warfare, it was mathematics." The bridgehead expansion demonstrated this mathematical superiority daily. On March 8, American forces held a shallow bridgehead 3 miles deep. By March 10, the bridgehead extended 8 miles. By March 15, it was 15 miles deep and 30 miles wide. American units advanced not because of brilliant maneuver or tactical innovation, but because German resistance collapsed under material weight. German units in the Remagen sector reported being outnumbered 10-1 in infantry, 20-1 in tanks, 50-1 in artillery. These were not exaggerations. The air superiority over Remagen illustrated the production disparity most clearly. The Luftwaffe sortied perhaps 500 aircraft against the bridges over 10 days, a maximum effort that stripped other sectors of air cover. The Americans, by contrast, maintained standing patrols of 30 to 50 fighters over Remagen continuously, with additional hundreds of aircraft available on call. American fighter production in March 1945 exceeded 2,000 aircraft. German fighter production had fallen below 300. Every German aircraft lost over Remagen was irreplaceable. Every American aircraft lost was replaced within days. The American air campaign around Remagen demonstrated lavish material abundance. Fighters flew multiple sorties daily, burning fuel at rates that would have kept German squadrons grounded for weeks. Anti-aircraft positions around the bridgehead fired thousands of shells daily, creating defensive fire so dense that German pilots reported being unable to approach close enough to identify targets. The ammunition expenditure by American anti-aircraft artillery in a single day exceeded monthly allocations for entire German flak divisions. Ground combat around the perimeter showed similar patterns. German counterattacks were broken not by American infantry prowess, but by artillery fire. American artillery doctrine called for time-on-target barrages, multiple batteries firing from different positions, timed so all shells arrived simultaneously, creating sudden, devastating concentrations. These barrages used ammunition quantities that German artillery officers couldn't comprehend. A single American artillery battalion could fire in one day what a German battalion was allocated for a month. Tank engagements were brief and one-sided. The few German tanks that reached the Remagen perimeter faced American Sherman tanks in numbers that made tactical skill irrelevant. Yes, German Panthers and Tigers had better armor and guns than Shermans. But when 5 Shermans engaged one Panther, and the Shermans could be replaced in days while the Panther was irreplaceable, technical superiority meant nothing. American tankers developed simple tactics, fixed the German tank frontally while others flanked it. Given numerical superiority, these tactics worked reliably. The most devastating American advantage was repair and replacement capacity. When American tanks were damaged, recovery vehicles towed them to field maintenance units where skilled mechanics, with ample spare parts, repaired them. Most combat-damaged American tanks returned to service within 48 hours. German tanks, when damaged, were often abandoned because recovery vehicles lacked fuel to retrieve them, or spare parts didn't exist, or trained mechanics were unavailable. A German tank with a thrown track often became a permanent loss. An American tank with a thrown track was back in action the next day. By March 20, the Remagen bridgehead contained 8 American divisions, over 200,000 troops. German forces opposing them numbered perhaps 30,000, organized into ad hoc units with grandiose names, divisions commanded by colonels, corps commanded by major generals. These German units fought with determination and skill, making Americans pay for every advance, but determination without resources only prolonged the inevitable. The bridgehead broke out on March 22. American armored columns plunged eastward into Germany's interior, encountering resistance that collapsed almost immediately. German units retreated or surrendered. The Rhine barrier, which German propaganda had promised would stop the Allies for months, had been breached in a single afternoon and expanded into an unstoppable offensive in 2 weeks. General Bradley later assessed Remagen's impact. The bridge at Remagen gave us a bridgehead months ahead of schedule. It shortened the war. More importantly, it demonstrated that German resistance was brittle. The Wehrmacht could fight skillfully when holding prepared positions, but it couldn't respond to sudden crises. It lacked the mobility, the reserves, the communication systems, the supplies. It couldn't move forces fast enough to seal breaches. Once we were across the Rhine in strength, German defeat became a matter of time. The human cost at Remagen was remarkably light by World War II standards. American casualties taking and expanding the bridgehead totaled approximately 1,500 killed and wounded over 2 weeks. German casualties were higher but difficult to assess exactly, perhaps 3,500 killed, wounded, and captured. These numbers were minute compared to battles like the Bulge or Huichen Forest. Remagen's significance was strategic, not tactical. It didn't involve mass slaughter. It involved one intact bridge and the exploitation of an opportunity. For the Germans, Remagen represented more than a military defeat. It symbolized the collapse of their entire defense strategy. Every German plan for defending the Reich had assumed the Rhine would be an impenetrable barrier requiring massive resources to cross. The Allies were expected to concentrate forces for months before attempting a crossing, giving Germany time to organize resistance. The capture at Remagen invalidated these assumptions instantly. If the Allies could get across the Rhine accidentally, opportunistically, then no German defense line would hold. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. Soldiers who had been told the Rhine could not be crossed, that Germany would fight to the last from behind this natural fortress, now saw American tanks driving through German heartland. Promises from propaganda had proven worthless. Why continue fighting when every promise of successful defense proved false? Lieutenant Friesenhahn, in captivity, was asked repeatedly why the demolitions had failed. His answer was technically detailed but emotionally exhausted. The primary circuit failed. Perhaps American artillery cut it. Perhaps sabotage. Perhaps simple failure. We had tested it that morning and it worked. The secondary charges detonated but weren't sufficient. We needed the primary charges and they didn't fire. The bridge was built to withstand attacks. It was too strong for partial demolition. The question that haunted German survivors was more fundamental than technical failure. Why was there only one engineer officer, one company to defend the bridge, minimal troops to hold it? The answer was simple and damning. Germany had no more to send. The Wehrmacht in March 1945 was a hollow force, divisions on paper with battalion strength in reality, armies commanded by generals controlling fewer troops than peacetime regiments. Every sector demanded reinforcements. None received adequate forces. Remagen was left vulnerable not through oversight but through exhaustion. American production capacity made the Remagen exploitation possible. Within days of the bridge's capture, American engineers had constructed multiple additional bridges. Heavy pontoon bridges carried continuous traffic. Bailey bridges were erected for lighter vehicles. By March 20, more tonnage was crossing American-built bridges near Remagen than had crossed the Ludendorff Bridge at its pre-war peacetime peak. American engineering units constructed in days what Germany had built over years. The contrast extended to bridge construction methods. American engineers assembled Bailey bridges from prefabricated components, working from detailed plans, with standardized parts that could be assembled by any trained engineer unit. German bridge building in 1945 was improvised, using whatever materials could be found, assembled by exhausted troops with inadequate equipment. Americans built to engineered specifications with testing and safety margins. Germans built whatever would hold temporarily and hoped. The broader strategic situation made Remagen's impact even more devastating for Germany. In the east, Soviet forces had reached the Oder River, only 40 miles from Berlin. In the west, Americans were now across the Rhine. Germany was being crushed between two material juggernauts, each possessing industrial capacity that dwarfed German production even at its 1943 peak. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Only its duration remained uncertain, and Remagen shortened that duration. German military professionals understood the implications immediately. General Siegfried Westphal, Kesselring's chief of staff, assessed the situation bluntly. After Remagen, defending Germany became impossible. We could slow the American advance. We could make them pay for their progress, but we couldn't stop them. The mathematics were irrefutable. They had unlimited resources. We had none. This was not exaggeration. American forces in Europe in March 1945 consumed approximately 800,000 tons of supplies monthly. This figure included everything: food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, construction materials. The entire German war economy in March 1945 produced perhaps 500,000 tons of war material monthly, and much of that never reached frontline troops due to transportation system collapse. The Americans were consuming more supplies monthly on one front than Germany's entire economy could produce. The fuel situation was particularly stark. American mechanized units used gasoline prodigiously. Tank battalions, truck companies, aviation units consumed fuel at rates that seemed wasteful, because they were, deliberately. American logistics doctrine assumed abundant fuel and mechanized everything possible to save time and lives. A single American armored division used more gasoline in a day than an entire German Army Corps received in a week, when German units received any fuel allocation at all. By late March, German units around the Remagen sector were reporting that they had no fuel for tactical movement. Tanks sat immobile, used as static gun positions because they couldn't move. Trucks were abandoned because they couldn't run. Infantry walked everywhere because no vehicles could transport them. Meanwhile, American supply trucks ran continuously, often half-empty, because American logistics prioritized speed over efficiency. Better to run half-empty trucks continuously than wait to fill them completely. The artillery ammunition disparity was perhaps most shocking to German officers. American artillery doctrine assumed unlimited ammunition availability. Fire missions were approved casually, target adjustment conducted leisurely. Firing continued until observers were satisfied. German doctrine in 1945 assumed each shell was precious, fire missions carefully rationed, ammunition expenditure scrutinized. American batteries fired more ammunition daily than German batteries fired monthly. This disparity created tactical situations that were surreal to German veterans. German forces dug into positions around the Remagen perimeter, reported American artillery, barrages that lasted hours, systematic destructions of every suspected position. Americans would fire for 30 minutes at a farmhouse that might contain an observation post. They would drop hundreds of shells on a tree line that might conceal infantry. When they encountered resistance, they stopped advancing and called an overwhelming fire. From a German perspective accustomed to ammunition shortages, such expenditure seemed insane. From an American perspective with abundant supplies, it was merely prudent. The same pattern repeated with small arms ammunition. American infantry squads carried hundreds of rounds per man, with more available from supply trucks that followed close behind front lines. German infantry by March 1945 often carried fewer than 100 rounds per man, with resupply uncertain. American squads fired suppressive bursts liberally, using ammunition to avoid casualties. German squads fired aimed shots sparingly, rationing every round. The difference was audible in combat. American positions crackled with continuous fire. German positions responded with carefully aimed single shots. Air support demonstrated the disparity most visibly. American ground units could request close air support and receive it within minutes. Fighter bombers circled overhead on standing patrols, ready to attack any target identified. When Americans encountered resistance, they marked targets with colored smoke and withdrew while aircraft destroyed the position. German units had no air support. The Luftwaffe barely existed. German soldiers hadn't seen friendly aircraft in months. They heard American aircraft constantly, saw them daily, and could do nothing but hide. The medical support contrast affected morale significantly. American soldiers knew that if wounded, they would receive immediate professional care, evacuation to field hospitals within hours, treatment with modern medicine including antibiotics, blood plasma, professional surgery. Survival rates for American wounded were remarkably high. German soldiers knew that wounds likely meant death, either immediately from lack of treatment or slowly from infection and neglect. German medical facilities were overwhelmed, undersupplied, and understaffed. Being wounded while in German service in March 1945 was often a death sentence. Being wounded and captured by Americans was often life-saving. This created perverse incentives. German soldiers, particularly those pressed into service in Volkssturm or other makeshift units, knew that surrender might be their best survival strategy. Fighting meant probable death. Surrender meant food, medical care, survival. German propaganda about American atrocities convinced no one who had actually encountered Americans. Word spread among German troops that Americans treated prisoners well, fed them, provided medical care. Conversely, surrendering to Soviets meant likely death or slavery. But Americans had food and seemed almost embarrassed by how much they had. Interrogation reports from German prisoners captured around Remagen revealed consistent themes. First, shock at American material abundance. Second, bitterness at German propaganda lies. Third, relief at survival. A typical prisoner statement. They told us Americans were cowards, that they would break under determined attack. This was a lie. They told us American soldiers were poor quality. Another lie. What they didn't tell us was that Americans had unlimited everything. Tanks, planes, food, ammunition, medicine. How could we fight that? We were hungry, cold, out of ammunition, and they wanted us to stop an army that threw away more supplies than we received. The Remagen bridgehead also demonstrated American organizational efficiency. Within days of the bridge's capture, American engineers had established fuel depots, ammunition dumps, supply points, maintenance facilities, medical stations. They built roads, laid communication lines, erected headquarters buildings. The bridgehead became a small city organized to support military operations. German forces, by contrast, struggled to maintain basic organization. Communication systems failed. Supply systems collapsed. Units lost contact with headquarters. Orders arrived late or not at all. This organizational efficiency reflected American industrial management principles applied to military operations. American staff officers organized supply chains using techniques from civilian business. They tracked inventory, scheduled deliveries, monitored consumption rates, projected future needs. Supply sergeants managed ammunition like warehouse managers managed stock, keeping careful records, rotating inventory, ensuring continuous availability. This might seem mundane, but it was revolutionary in practice. German military logistics in 1945 was chaos, improvisations, desperate expedients, perpetual shortages. The broader implications extended beyond Remagen. The bridgehead demonstrated that Germany couldn't defend anything successfully once Americans concentrated force against it. This meant American strategy could be straightforward. Concentrate overwhelming force, advance, repeat. There was no need for tactical brilliance or operational sophistication. Material superiority made victory certain. The only question was cost, and Americans used material abundance to minimize human cost. This wasn't the romantic warfare of tactical genius and operational artistry. This was industrial warfare at its most basic, production-determined outcome. Germany had lost the production war catastrophically. By March 1945, American war production exceeded German production in virtually every category by factors of 5 to 10. Germany couldn't build enough tanks, planes, guns, shells, bullets to contest American attacks. They couldn't feed their soldiers adequately, fuel their vehicles, supply their hospitals. The Wehrmacht in March 1945 was an army in name only, armed men organized in formations, but lacking the material basis for sustained combat. German generals in their post-war memoirs often attributed defeat to various factors: Hitler's strategic errors, fighting on two fronts, ideological fanaticism overwhelming military rationality. These factors mattered, but they obscured the fundamental reality. Germany lost because it couldn't produce enough war material to match its enemies. German industry at peak performance couldn't match American production. Once strategic bombing destroyed German industrial capacity, outcome was certain. The Rhine crossing at Remagen symbolized this industrial defeat. Germans couldn't prevent Americans from crossing because they lacked the forces, and they lacked the forces because they couldn't produce or transport the equipment those forces needed. The bridge survived German demolition attempts partly due to technical failures, but mainly because Germany couldn't even demolish its own infrastructure effectively. They lacked the explosives, or the electrical systems failed, or the engineer units were inadequate. Everything was breaking down. By April 1, American forces had expanded the Remagen bridgehead into a broad salient driving deep into Germany. The Rhine barrier no longer existed as a defensive line. American armies were advancing into central Germany against crumbling resistance. Soviet armies were approaching from the east. Germany's defeat was weeks away, merely a matter of completing the destruction of already shattered military forces. The Ludendorff Bridge itself, collapsed on March 17, remained where it had fallen in the Rhine. American engineers made no attempt to salvage it. They didn't need to. They had built multiple newer, stronger bridges around it. The old bridge had served its purpose. Its twisted steel girders, jutting from the river like broken bones, became a memorial to the moment Germany's last defensive barrier fell. For the men who captured it, Remagen became a story told for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, who led the first crossing, survived the war and returned to small-town America, forever known as the officer who took the bridge. Sergeant Alexander Drabick, the first across, received public recognition but returned to working-class life in Ohio. The soldiers who ran across that bridge under fire did something genuinely heroic, but they also benefited from factors beyond their control: German incompetence, technical failures, and most importantly, an American military machine backed by industrial power Germany couldn't match. The lesson of Remagen, when stripped of romantic heroism narrative, is fundamentally economic. Military outcomes in modern industrial warfare are determined primarily by production capacity. Tactics matter, strategy matters, leadership matters, courage matters, but they matter within constraints set by industrial capacity. Germany's tactical skill, operational creativity, and soldiers' courage couldn't overcome material inferiority. Americans didn't outfight Germans at Remagen. They outproduced them, overwhelmed them, buried them under material weight. This lesson, however, comes with a critical caveat. American production supremacy derived from democratic industrial mobilization. Free workers in American factories produced more than enslaved laborers in German-occupied territories. Voluntary cooperation exceeded coerced effort. American war production surged not despite democratic governance, but because of it. Workers who had a stake in their society's survival, who benefited from victory, who believed in their cause, worked more effectively than slaves who had every reason to sabotage production. The comparison was direct and damning. Germany increasingly relied on slave labor from conquered territories. Millions of people forced to work in German factories, mines, and farms produced less and worse than voluntary American workers. Sabotage was endemic in German war production. Quality control was unreliable. The most sophisticated German weapons often failed because forced laborers deliberately built them poorly. American weapons, built by workers who earned good wages and took pride in their work, functioned reliably. This wasn't accidental. Democratic societies mobilized more effectively for total war than dictatorships because democratic governance created social cohesion. Americans believed in their cause, trusted their government reasonably, and saw themselves as stakeholders in victory. They worked harder, accepted rationing, bought war bonds, and volunteered for military service because they understood the war's necessity and believed victory served their interests. Germans, especially by 1945, fought because they were terrorized into fighting, because desertion meant execution, because they had no alternative. Coercion motivates survival, not excellence. The American soldiers who crossed the Rhine at Remagen represented this democratic mobilization. They were citizen soldiers, civilians in uniform, who wanted to win and go home. They weren't fighting for conquest or ideology or racial supremacy. They were fighting to defeat fascism and resume normal lives. This straightforward motivation produced effective combat performance without fanaticism. American soldiers fought competently, used available resources intelligently, and accepted reasonable risks. They didn't seek death gloriously. They sought victory efficiently. March 7, 1945, German officers had laughed at American military capacity, dismissing reports of overwhelming production as propaganda. March 17, 1945, those officers were dead, captured, or fleeing eastward before American advances. Their laughter had become history's most expensive miscalculation. They had underestimated not just American production, but the systemic superiority of democratic industrial mobilization. They had assumed that military tradition, tactical skill, and ideological fervor could overcome material inferiority. They were catastrophically wrong. The final lesson of Remagen, the lesson its capture and exploitation demonstrated conclusively, is ancient but perpetually relevant. Dismissing democratic nations as weak because they prefer peace is foolish. Underestimating free people's productive capacity when mobilized invites catastrophic miscalculation. Democracies are generally slow to anger and reluctant to fight, but once committed, they mobilize resources autocracies cannot match. The bridge at Remagen stood as symbol of this truth. Germany's best efforts couldn't destroy it, while American determination captured and exploited it within hours. The outcome was never in doubt. Only the timing was uncertain, and at Remagen even that became clear.